Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership and today's CivEx, the future of election system reform in Arizona. My name is Blake Saka, and I'm a 2017 Flinn-Brown Civic Leadership Academy Fellow. We have a great group of experts prepared to talk with you today. Today's session is co-sponsored by the Flinn Foundation and the Southern Arizona Leadership Council, and we'd like to thank leaders Don Wallace and Ted Maxwell for their support. First today, we're going to hear from two Flinn-Brown Fellows who will provide us with an overview of elections and election system reform here in Arizona. Then we'll introduce our panelists and answer your questions. If you have a question for the panel, please place that in the Q&A tab in Zoom. If you have a comment for the panelists or the audience members, please place those in the chat. Before we begin, we'd like to learn a little bit more about our audience today. Please help us by responding to each of our three poll questions. First, what area of our state are you joining from today? Great. As you can see, most of the folks are joining from the urban areas, but we do have some rural folks joining as well. So thank you for that. Second, we'd like to know what sector you represent as you're joining us today. And it looks like we have a pretty broad mix of folks joining us today. So we look forward to all of you engaging with interesting questions from each of your perspectives. Finally, we'd like to ask you, what election system reform do you think would most benefit our state? And you have to read these questions, so we'll give you a couple extra minutes to think through those and vote. All right, we appreciate your interest there, as well as JP for his write-in vote. So these results are pretty consistent with some of the polling that Luis and Charlie will talk about later, and perhaps Gina will mention as well from the work that they've done. So we appreciate that, and we're going to talk about each one of those areas a little bit, at least, as we go through today. So thank you for that. We appreciate your sharing your interests. So we're going to start the panel today with Gina Roberts. Gina is a 2019 Flinn-Brown Civic Leadership Academy Fellow. She's the Voter Education Director for the Citizens Clean Election Commission. She administers a robust public education program that strives to encourage participation in the political process from voters across the state. Gina is well-versed in election policy and administration, and her experience includes administering elections for the city of Peoria, as well as serving as the elections manager for the Arizona Secretary of State. Welcome, Gina.
Hi, Blake. Thank you so much for that introduction. Hello, everybody. And I want to reiterate what Blake said and thank both the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership and for hosting this event for us. And of course, the Southern Arizona Leadership Council. We think this is an important discussion. Before I jump into my presentation, I just wanted to share when Blake was giving those polls, the questions out there, I went to actually vote, and then I saw a notice that panelists could not vote, and I just wanted to share that really invigorated me for this discussion today. So great way to start things. I am going to share my screen so I can share a presentation with everybody. So hopefully you all can see my screen now. And I wanted to provide everybody with some information about the turnout in the 2020 general election. So one thing that's really great is we saw 2020 break records. We really saw high engagement from voters. It was one of the highest turnouts in Arizona's history, where we almost broke 80% statewide, which is really fantastic. When we look at Arizona as a whole compared to the nation in terms of turnout, we ranked 30th. So I wanted to share that information with you as we continue this discussion about possible election reform, and as we think about, maybe what has worked well for other states. So according, again, to the information that I pulled, and my sources here were the Arizona Secretary of State's office and the United States Election Project. Turnout nationwide was about 66%. So, we can see Arizona again, and we'll talk about that, about how Arizona perhaps was a battleground state, and there was a lot of focus on Arizona. Our voters really showed up on election day. To pause briefly, I just wanted to show you where we are at today. So looking at the voter registration numbers from the 2020 general election to our most recent stats, which is from April, not much of a difference. So we're really looking at the same amount of total registered voters across the state. So you can see the breakdown here. I mean, very, very small differences that we're talking about. So we're pretty much on par with where we were at in the 2020 general election. So who was our Arizona voter? I think when we look at, who actually turned out to vote, things that are very important in my mind as we look at our electorate are the demographics, the age. So we can see here that when we look at, hopefully my panelist screen here is not in the way of everybody's view. If it is, Blake, please let me know, since I'm just sharing my screen. But when we look at the breakdown by age, we can see the totals here between 18 to 29, 30 to 44, and so on. And we really see the highest amount are those 60 plus voters. So when just to give you an idea, when we look at more demographics, a snapshot of Maricopa County, we can see that we, in terms of who turned out based on gender, females were at the highest with 49.4% compared to males. So again, keep this in mind when we discuss about election reform, who is turning out to vote, and who are these voters? And then I think equally, and perhaps if not more importantly, how are they voting? So when you consider election reform, are we talking about dates and deadlines? Are we talking about more opportunities to get to the polls and cast your ballot? Arizona is primarily a vote by mail state. You can see here that our voters, they prefer to vote early as compared to on election day. So we're not really talking about election day, are we? We're talking about an election season. Early voting in Arizona begins 27 days before the election. So for the general election, that began on October 7th. And so we really see, Arizona voters like to vote at their convenience. They want to get their ballot mailed to them. They want to vote early and take their time with that ballot and return it. So a very small percentage of our electorate is actually turning out on election day. So again, what does that hold there when we talk about election reform, when people are actually voting, whether it's same day registration? Then we're really talking about a 27-day registration period here, right? Since early voting runs 27 days before the election. And I should note that the voter registration deadline is always 29 days before the election. So what are some of the motivators that encouraged our electorate to get out the vote? We like to call it the Super Bowl of elections. And the reason why we call it that is because that's what voters have told us in focus groups that we hold. The presidential election is the Super Bowl of elections. You can't escape it. It's constantly in the media, it's on social media. That's all anybody's talking about or discussing. So it's so prominent that you want to participate. You have that fear of missing out. You want to participate in that Super Bowl of elections. The other motivator is Arizona had the US Senate race on the ballot. That was huge, where we would see that Clean Elections actually sponsored a debate for the US Senate candidates with Arizona Horizon PBS. And it ended up being the third highest ranking show ever for PBS across all PBS stations across the nation. So interest was really high in that US Senate race. So what's on the ballot? That can be a huge motivator. And then of course, the coverage of elections. Is the media covering this election? What's the media coverage for a United States presidential election race compared to your local city council race? So having that election coverage in the media is a huge motivator for voters to get out and vote, because again, it's right there in front of them. It's that information that's being presented to the voter. And then of course we have our campaign spending. So Arizona was, and you'll see this on my next slide, we'll talk about spending a little bit more, but Arizona was a hotspot for all of those campaign dollars and for messaging for candidates and campaigns. And then of course there's social media. I think we all have experience in that, right? We all saw our timelines, whether it was Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, you could not escape anything, any discussions regarding the presidential election. Facebook even had a filter where you could try to filter it out, but still it kept through. And so some of these images, these pictures that I have here, these are media and messaging that Clean Elections put out, because our goal at Clean Elections is to promote participation in the election. So we want every voter across the state to vote. And our messaging is factual. It's focused on the logistics of voting, what you need to know. So here's, the dates and deadlines, things like that. But still, it's part of that messaging pool that voters are inundated with. And all of those are contributing factors to why somebody stepped out and voted. So to talk a little bit about campaign spending, as we think about those motivators, I mean, we saw here that Phoenix has become the top individual advertising market for the 2020 White House race. This was during the summertime of 2020. And this information you can get from opensecrets.org. Again, going back to what's on the ballot, the US Senate race, $256 million was spent on that race alone. And so again, that comes down to media. Voters are being inundated with the information about the elections. So if they know about the elections, they know the important dates, they know the issues that are on the ballot, they know the candidates that are out there, that's where you're going to see somebody turn out to vote. So there's definitely contributing factors to our high turnout rate for the 2020 general election. So some of the challenges. I'll spend a little bit of time on this screen, and I think we all know, if you're tuning in for this CivEx, that you follow along in elections, and we know that conversations are still occurring about the 2020 general election. But election administrators, as we talk about election reform, when we consider the actual administration of elections, there were a lot of challenges in 2020 that our election officials had to face and deal with, so we could bring voters that opportunity to cast their ballot. Of course, we had COVID. We had to figure out, okay, how can we allow voters to safely cast their ballot in person? Our current polling places, are they large enough to accommodate physical distancing? And are we exposing our poll workers, and maybe who are some of our most vulnerable populations, since poll workers tend to be on the elderly side? So what we did was we helped launch a campaign for poll workers and for maybe some of our younger, healthier citizens to step up and serve as poll workers if they were able to. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Arizona really is a vote by mail state when we look at the percentages of the electorate who choose to vote early. So that really helped, because we promoted a campaign where people understood how ballot by mail works. That way they could decide, okay, does this work best for me and my family? So again, really educating voters about their options during COVID was definitely a challenge. And we think it worked out really well, because we had a lot of communication with voters, and they were happy for all the options that they had so that they could cast their ballot safely. There were challenges that were outside of election officials' control, obviously COVID was, but the United States Postal Service, there was a lot of changes that were being made that could interrupt or delay mail delivery time. So we had to educate voters about, okay, this is your time frame for when you need to request your ballot and when you need to return it if you're going to be doing that through the US mail system. So there's a lot of conversations about that. And then with that went challenges and education about the security of ballot by mail. due to COVID and due to the challenges of the United States postal system, we saw voters who typically did vote in person want to consider, how do I vote by mail? And so we had to, as election officials, talk to them about, well, here are all the different security measures and security layers that are in process to protect your ballot when it's sent out to you and when you return it. And here's all your options. If you don't feel comfortable sending it back in the mail with your mailman, that's okay. We have secured ballot drop boxes for you, or you can drop it off at any polling place. Lots of conversations about that with voters who wanted to perhaps use the ballot by mail system for the first time this year. One of the biggest challenges that we faced and we continue to face is misinformation. And I think, that goes along with social media. But, again, there was so much discussion about the 2020 general election. And we talk about what skill sets election administrators need to have. Well, that really includes a public relations component to it, because in addition to actually administering the election, all of our election officials had to continue to educate the public and the media, but fight any misinformation that was out there. So if there was information that posted a wrong date or a deadline, and again, misinformation can really go viral in this day and age of social media. So we had to be able to react quickly to that and work with all of the social media platforms. Election officials established a relationship with Facebook, with Instagram, with Twitter, with YouTube, on how can we report and identify that misinformation, and how can we quickly get it taken down, and then how do we get our messaging out there so we can get the accurate information to voters. And again, one challenge that I specifically want to call out is what was referred to as Sharpiegate, because even though that stemmed from Maricopa County, we saw states across our nation that had to deal with this as well too, because it went viral, it just blew up. And what Sharpiegate was there was a YouTube video where somebody was at a polling place and they were talking to voters, and voters expressed concerns that when they were voting their ballot in Maricopa County, the poll worker issued them a Sharpie pen. And when they filled out their ballot, they noticed that the ink bled through to the other side of the ballot. And they were concerned that maybe their ballot wasn't getting read properly. But then there was also concerns about maybe that Sharpie pen was only given to certain voters, depending on their political affiliation. So a lot of discussions and education had to come out from election officials, because Maricopa County, they actually have new election equipment and new ballot designs where bleed through was okay, because it didn't impact any of the races that were printed on the other side, and the machines could still read that. And the reason why Sharpies were issued was because it worked better with the precinct tabulators. The other thing is, a lot of challenges that we went through and we're still going through today. How do I know my ballot was counted? Recounts and audits. But basically where we were at is a lot of this stemmed down to combating this with voter education. So I'll leave you with an election administrator saying that we like to talk about. And it's really, when you talk about elections and election reform, pick two. Do you want your elections fast, cheap, or accurate? So you can only have two. You can't have all three. And with that, I'm happy to wrap things up and answer any questions and turn it over to Blake. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gina, for giving us a great overview of the electorate. And again, I'll remind you, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will get them to Gina when we get to that section. So next up, I'd like to invite Patrick McWhortor to join us. Patrick was a member of the inaugural 2011 Flinn-Brown Civic Leadership Academy class. He's a consultant providing leadership, strategy, board development, and team building services for businesses of all sizes, specializing as an interim executive for nonprofits. Patrick has been active in civic participation efforts and election reform advocacy, including the open primaries campaign from 2016. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Blake, and thank you all for joining us today. I see we have about 75 people here. This is obviously a topic of great interest, and I'll be sharing my screen as well with presentation. So give me just 1 second to make sure that we can pull that up here. Okay. So I also want to amplify on my biography that Blake just gave you, that I also serve on the board of the Arizona Advocacy Network, and currently the chair. And that is an organization dedicated to protecting democracy and advocating for voter rights. So obviously this is where I put my time as a volunteer in the community. It's something I've been passionate about for many, many years. And so I look forward to our discussion today about all the possibilities for ongoing reform now and in the future. But my role today is to give you a little bit of the history of election reform in Arizona and sort of set the stage for what may happen going forward. So we know today that there is a lot of interest in reform. We're seeing it all over in the headlines, both nationally and here in Arizona. So as an illustration of this, this is some data that I collected myself looking through the Arizona State Legislature website on just how many bills are being considered at the state legislature this year in Arizona dealing with our election process and election systems and voting. And as you can see, the House committee that deals with these issues has seen about 60 bills, and the Senate committee more than 40 bills. Now, keep in mind, some of those are duplicate because, say, a bill passes the House, it then moves over to the Senate. So it's the same bill showing up twice in the count here. But obviously, there is a lot of interest in election at the state legislature this year. Now, I don't know how many total laws are passed because, of course, the legislature is still in session, and we won't know till the end of session just how many passed. But I also did some research on how many laws have been passed each year by the state legislature dealing with elections. And I went back to 2001. So essentially looking at the 21st century so far for the state of Arizona. And as you'll see, now this is actual laws that were passed. So these numbers are lower because these are ones that actually got to the governor's desk and the governor signed into law. And so the trend overall is that typically, there's a lot of double-digit years and so forth, but you can also see that there's an increase in the last 10 years or so. So there's a growing interest. And a way to look at that is to analyze those data. And you'll see that from 2001 to 2019, on average, the number was 9.2 or 9.3 per year. That's 9 laws per year passed by the legislature. That's not by voters. We'll talk about that in a moment. That's just by the legislature. And in the first 10 years, the average was 7.7, and in the last 10 years, it's 11.2. So clearly, there was a growing interest by legislators in dealing with our election laws and voting. Now, you should know I left out 2020 for a reason. The pandemic foreshortened legislative session last year. There was only one law passed, so it would have skewed the results a little bit. But who knows? Maybe 2021 will balance that out since there's so many bills under consideration. So now, what this tells us is our state legislators, it's probably no surprise, are very interested in elections, right? I mean, that's how they get their job, and so they pay a lot of attention to election laws a lot of the time. But they are not the only ones, because in Arizona, we have a long tradition of using direct democracy, the tools of direct democracy, particularly the initiative, as well as referenda, in order to deal with elections. And actually, that was where my first introduction to election system reform occurred, which was 20 years ago. So in 1920, I can't do math, 40 years ago, in 1982, the voters of Arizona passed the system that allows you to register to vote when you get your driver's license. We were the first state in the nation to do that. And that's because there were a group of voters that were very interested in expanding voting rights. And they thought this would be a way of making it easier for people to get registered to vote. And I was a volunteer that pounded the hot pavement during this summer in Phoenix, gathering signatures to put this on the ballot. So this is really a tradition in Arizona. For those who don't know our history as a state, I mean, we started out putting direct democracy at the center of our story. You know, Arizona was supposed to become a state earlier than it did, but President Taft vetoed our first statehood bill because included in the original Constitution was a measure allowing for the recall of judges, and he thought that was a terrible idea, so he vetoed statehood. That's why we're not the 47th state. And so the Constitutional Committee went back and rewrote the Constitution, taking the recall provision out. And the act creating Arizona as a state was passed again and signed on February 14th, 1912. And then just a few months later, the voters of Arizona went right back to the ballot and put the recall of judges right back in the Constitution. So Arizona's have a long tradition of using direct democracy to basically fix things that they think the politicians aren't doing right. And so if you look at our history, of course, we have used the tools of direct democracy with great frequency, and especially when it comes to elections and voting. So we've had 55 election cycles in our state's history, and that has included 214 initiatives and referenda dealing with elections. That's basically almost four ballot measures in every election cycle that deal with something addressing elections or voting. So this is really where a lot of the action is in election reform. And it's just a way to illustrate that. I'm not going to go into great detail, but just highlight some of the election reforms over the past 40 years, beginning with that motor voter registration, Prop 202, that passed in 1982. 4 years later, the voters were asked to introduce campaign contribution limits. So campaign financing is another one of the areas that is often addressed through reform. And that was when we put the first contribution limits into our state elections in Arizona. 1992 saw an interesting issue facing the voters, because in 1988, the voters had been asked to create a runoff for the state elections for statewide office. And then in 1990, they had a very expensive runoff for governor, and the legislature said, well, that wasn't such a good idea after all. So they asked the voters to get rid of it, and the voters did in 1992. And in the very same year, the voters put term limits into effect. 1998, 6 years later, was a wave of election reform, including the election protection measure. We know that's the measure that says the legislature can't change substantively laws that were passed by the voters through direct democracy. That same year is when independents were given the right to vote in party primaries. Again, that was passed by the voters. And that was also the year, 1998, when clean elections was passed. So 1998 was a big reform year. And then just 2 years later, the voters established the Independent Redistricting Commission to redraw the boundaries of legislative and congressional districts every 10 years. 4 years later, we were back at the ballot dealing with voting issues with the requirement for proof of citizenship in order to vote in Arizona elections. And 2 years after that, interestingly, there were two measures. They both failed. Now, I've been just really highlighting the ones that passed, but I thought it interesting to mention these, because in 1 year we had measures that in a way was, I think, maybe countering the 2004 law, which was to say, hey, let's actually give citizens the right to vote by mail, because back then voting by mail wasn't nearly as common as it is today. However, that failed. And the other measure was a lottery. So that was a measure that said a random voter would be selected, somebody who actually voted, and would win $1 million. And the voters didn't pass that. And then in 2012, 6 years later, we saw the open primaries, more sort of systemic reform coming back into play. That's, but just for the record, that's not the campaign I worked on. I was working on the campaign we were hoping to get on the ballot in 2016, but we never got to the ballot that year, but it had failed already in 2012. And then in 2018, there were some changes made to the clean election system, partially dealing with various issues raised by court decisions with clean elections over the years. So the story here is that for the past 40 years, we have been very busy as voters in the every 2 years in the initiative and referendum process in working on voting reform. So you might say that we're wild about reform, and we keep trying over and over again to improve the system, because the last set of reforms, I don't know, I guess they didn't get the job done. Now, that's not an argument. I'm not trying to make an argument for not doing reform, but I think it's important as we look at reform going forward to say, are we really engaging in reform fatigue with the voters? It's just an interesting question. Maybe we can talk about in the discussion section. So with that, I hope it gives you a nice context for our discussion today, and I look forward to the panel and the dialogue to come.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Patrick, for a great history lesson. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our three panelists today. Luis Acosta-Herrera has a strong background in Arizona politics, spanning almost a decade's worth of advocacy. Most recently, he was the state director for Mike Bloomberg for President campaign and has had stops at the Arizona Chamber of Commerce, the Arizona Chamber Foundation, Stand for Children Arizona, and Kyle Moyer and Company. Luis has helped candidates at the federal, state, and local levels across the country, and he's currently the executive director of the Arizona chapter of Unite America. Ted Maxwell is the president and CEO of the Southern Arizona Leadership Council. At SALC, Ted works with more than 140 CEOs, business, and community leaders involved in creating a vibrant future for the Tucson region and the state of Arizona by engaging the critical issues of education, infrastructure, healthcare, governance, as well as economic growth and innovation. Ted retired as a Major General in 2018 after 34 years of military service. His final military position was as Commander of the Arizona National Guard. And Charley Olena brings legislative and advocates together to enhance election integrity with an emphasis in Arizona, Connecticut, Kentucky, Ohio, and Washington. She's the Associate Director of State Affairs for Secure Democracy. I hope you're all as excited as I am to hear from our distinguished panelists. We're going to start out by asking each of them to spend 3 minutes or so telling us what election system reform means to them, why it's important, and a little about their current work. And Charley, will ask you to go first.
Thank you, Blake. Hi, everyone. My name is Charley Olena. I'm with Secure Democracy. We are a national nonpartisan organization dedicated to working across the political spectrum to enact common sense policy solutions that safeguard our elections and ensure that every eligible vote is counted. We have been deeply engaged in the legislative battles around voting rights and ballot access this session in Arizona, as well as elsewhere. But I wanted to talk a little bit today around some of the research and polling around voting rights that we have been working on. So voting rights this year has been thrust back into the national spotlight in response to the 2020 elections. And Arizona, of course, has become a hotspot for the voting rights debate. As you just saw from Patrick, there have been over 100 bills introduced this session that address voting. The Senate leadership has questioned the validity of the results and is currently embarking on a hand count of Maricopa County's ballots. And among all of this, we have seen increasing polarization around voting rights and the issue of elections. And at the risk of grossly oversimplifying the situation, I think the debate has largely been framed in one of two ways. Either Republican leadership calling for increased election security and Democrats calling it voter suppression, or Democrats calling for increased access and Republicans calling it voter fraud. So we've been engaging in extensive public opinion and messaging research to better understand where the general public is actually at on voting reform and to what extent voters are bought into this kind of partisan debate that is dominating the space right now. The first thing we found was that fair elections and the freedom to vote are top concerns for Americans. This fits in very well with what Patrick was mentioning, that people are interested in election reform and have been interested in election reform. And when we asked voters about voting issues alongside other issues like the economy, healthcare, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the environment, only jobs and economic well-being ranked at the top alongside fair elections and the freedom to vote. So we know that this is something that Americans are interested in and paying attention to. We also found that voters overwhelmingly support pro-access reforms, reforms such as automatic voter registration or extending the number of days of early voting that are available. And we saw this across party lines. These reforms received overwhelming support, including over 60% support amongst our Republican oversamples. But despite these trends in around policies, there is still a large concern amongst voters around the integrity of our elections. And what we discovered is that voters largely support critical election integrity measures like conducting election audits to make sure machines are working properly and verifying signatures on absentee ballots, but have very little awareness of the fact that most states, including Arizona, already require these measures under state law. So when we polled in Arizona, for example, our polling found that voters overwhelmingly support an election audit, but were completely unaware that Maricopa County, for example, had already completed multiple election audits of their election results. And finally, we found that while there are voters who kind of solidly believe either the Republican or Democratic Party line on voting rights right now, the largest camp of voters are those who are somewhere in between, who think there should be some changes to expand access and ensure that voting is convenient and accessible, as well as some changes to reduce the possibility of fraud. So we see that some of these partisan lines that have been kind of drawn on the issue aren't necessarily reflective of many of our voters. And so all of this research has kind of led us to draw several conclusions that I will go through very quickly because I'm out of time. But one, there is a hunger to ensure that our elections are fair and that access is protected. Two, there needs to be more education around our existing safeguards and integrity measures. And three, there's a huge opportunity for state leaders to be looking for the middle road here and looking at policies that can achieve both increased integrity and security amongst our elections and protect access to voters so that eligible voters aren't being turned away. So when we really think about the future of voting rights and election reform in Arizona, I think this way forward really rests with policies that both increase integrity while continuing our historic trend of expanding access to the ballot so that every eligible voter has the freedom to vote and the confidence to know that that vote is counted.
Thank you very much, Charlie, for sharing your expertise and perspective. So next, we'd like to bring in Luis.
Thank you, Blake, and thank you everyone for having me. As Blake said, my name is Luis Acosta. I am the state director at Unite Arizona. We are a state affiliate of Unite America. Unite America is a national nonprofit C4 that focuses on election reform across the country. We do have 4 pillars that we focus on, those 4 pillars being independent redistricting, nonpartisan primaries, ranked choice voting, and vote by mail. In order for us to get involved in anything policy-wise or politically, it has to touch one of those 4 pillars so that we jump in. All that being said, I think, I'm echoing a little bit of Charlie's points here in the sense that, I mean, we all know that it's just been an onslaught at the local level here in Arizona with regards to the various pieces of legislation that have moved forward and whatnot. But, from Unite America's perspective, I think the thing that we're focusing on is getting quality people in positions where they're running for office and doing the right thing, essentially, and ensuring that voters who are legally allowed to vote and can vote are voting and removing those barriers to access. One of the biggest things and one of the biggest priorities that we've been pushing locally, but also nationally, just because it's part of our overview, is ranked choice voting and nonpartisan primaries. And so as we've done national polling in places like Utah or Arizona, or wherever it might be, we see that voters still have a hunger to fix the issues that are affecting them at the local level. And it's up to us to figure out how to get those issues in front of voters. We were part of a local poll here a few weeks ago or a month or so ago where we polled the electorate. And I think one of the most interesting things that we got back from the poll itself was the fact that as we looked at the information that was brought back, it was surprising to see that immigration was at the top of voters' minds again, followed by education and then jobs in the economy, right? Things that we thought, had been moved around or whatnot. I know Invest in Ed happened and whatnot. Education was at the top, but then it was superseded by immigration again. But the thing that really caught us, it was interesting to us, was the fact that 48% of the people polled said that they did not believe that there was any election fraud in the 2020 election as it relates to Arizona. So what that meant to us was that there was a significant portion of the population that still thought that there was. I think it was roughly 30-something%. And so as we talk about our reforms and as we talk about the things that we want to do in the states and whatnot, we want to make sure that we look at voters and ensure that voters have increased access, that they have increased access to quality candidates, and that we are removing kind of the systems that force candidates into our pipeline or on our ballot who don't traditionally represent great swaths of the population. We want moderate folks from either party, doesn't matter, Republican, Independent, Democrat, whatever it might be. We don't really care as long as you're here for the right reasons, doing what's in the best interest of Arizonans day in and day out. That's my spiel on Unite America. Thank you so much, Blake, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A section.
Great, fantastic, Luis. We appreciate your time and expertise. So finally, we're going to invite Ted Maxwell to share. Ted, I think we're all curious to hear a business leader's perspective on these issues.
Well, Blake, thank you very much. And I appreciate everybody's engagement on this. It's good to see this many participants. Election reform, as pointed out by our early speakers, has been at the top of the mind of Arizonans for years, for decades. You've seen a lot of reforms, clean elections, that was going to fix it. Term limits, that would fix it. And we've always kind of focused on two sides of the house, the voters or the candidates. Now, as an organization, and Southern Arizona Leadership Council is a nonpartisan organization, which is focused on public policies in a lot of the areas that Blake mentioned earlier. So what's that mean? That means we try to influence elected officials to make sound legislation and sound policies that's going to support an economy that's going to be vibrant, going to be successful, and therefore will increase the quality of life for all Arizonans. That's what we try to do. So what's important about election reform to a business organization like ours? It's the electeds. It's the politicians. We have to have politicians and candidates that we can work with, that are not running for the next election, but are running for making good improvements for the state of Arizonans and everybody who lives here. And so when we talk election reform, you heard Charley and Luis mention a lot about the voters and what they see and how they feel and how they're acting. And for the record, I was very happy to hear from Charley that the majority of voters want to improve access to the ballots, but at the same time ensure that the access is secure and accurate, and voters that we want, that the people who are supposed to vote are voting. Because the poll Luis mentioned highlighted that there's not a lot of trust that both of those things are happening. There are people who believe that we're denying access to folks, and there are a lot of people in our state that believe that there's fraud going on inside of our elections as well. So at SLC, we have a saying all the time: systems matter. And the system we've got currently right now, honestly, encourages partisan politics. It doesn't encourage that engagement with the other party. It doesn't encourage finding common ground. What it encourages is candidates who are running as a Republican or a Democrat. And the realistic fact of the matter is, unless you're a Republican or a Democrat, you're probably not going to get elected. And how do you become that candidate from either the Republican or the Democratic Party? You do it by winning your primary. And where do you have to run to win your primary? You have to run to the extreme. You have to really run to that base. And as a matter of fact, if you vote in moderation or in a rational manner, or maybe you're working with the other party to take the really bad aspects of a bill off that legislation before they put it through, your biggest threat's getting primaried. So we've got a system right now that does not encourage participation, does not encourage high quality candidates to take a chance, put themselves out there and run. Two of the goals of our public policy or our governance focus area is just that: increase civic participation and raise and develop high quality candidates. So when we start talking election reform, we really are focused on the election. That's where we think we can fix the problem. We believe a lot of the problems we face, whether it's at the federal or at the state level, is in the primaries, because the primaries determine the two options we as voters are going to get. So we do want to take a look at what could work better, what it could be successful. Is it open primaries? Is it nonpartisan elections? I mean, remember, 28 of the 29 municipalities in Arizona already use nonpartisan open primaries for their elections. But there's a lot of different areas where we can go with this discussion. I'm looking forward to seeing some more specifics when we talk about the types of elections that are out there that may work, but it's going to be a big change. It is going to be a big change to Arizona. We've successfully, I believe, voted with 85% of the folks voting by mail, 15% showing up at the polls, but it's been pretty traditional partisan politics. And an open primary would change things significantly. So looking forward to the conversation, and thank you for the opportunity.
Great. Again, thank you very much for Ted. So we're now going to move into our final section of Q&A. So we'll invite Patrick and Gina to join us again. And remind the audience members, if you have questions, we have 3 of them already submitted in the Q&A section. Please submit those there and we will get to them. So the first question that we're going to start out with today goes to Gina. And Gina, we're going to ask you to share a little bit regarding the concerns or considerations of election system reform from an election administration perspective. Certainly, there have been lots of concerns about administering elections. And so in this challenging environment where there's concerns about fraud and not concerns about fraud, how do we approach election system reform, keeping in mind that we have to implement those reforms?
Sure, Blake. I think that's a great question. And when we talk about election reform, I think it's really important to consider the implementation of it and how that impacts the entire web, if you will, of election policies and procedures. Everything is connected. Elections run on a system of deadlines, dates and deadlines. And the reason for that is because you have to have finality in elections. And so when we talk about, well, what do we want to change in the system? You really need to think about and talk to your election officials. They can answer this for you about what would be impacted. And I'll give you an example. So let's talk about same-day voter registration. So there's a really great piece that came out from the Arizona Center for Investigative Reporting where they looked at rejected ballot rates in the 2020 general election. And there was a note in there, they reported that about 17,000 ballots were rejected because the voters missed the voter registration deadline. So when we talk about election reform and we're thinking, well, what is it that we're trying to solve? What is the problem or the issue that this reform will address and solve? So for the example of automatic voter registration, if we're saying that same-day registration would have allowed those 17,000 voters to have their ballot cast, that seems like a great thing. Now, from an election administrative perspective, let's take that down the line of all of the dates and deadlines. And what else does that impact, though? So in Arizona, we're kind of unique in Arizona where we actually have a bifurcated voter registration system where to vote on state races, you have to provide proof of citizenship. So if we have that same day registration, we have to identify as election officials, well, what races is this voter eligible to vote in? Did they provide sufficient proof of citizenship if we're talking about state races? And what's the time frame for that election official to verify that proof of citizenship? So those post-election day procedures are going to be pushed back, they're going to be implemented. So now we're talking about timeliness of results. So if we're okay with that being impacted, do the election officials have the tools that they need to accommodate this new change and process those registration forms, but it's going to impact their processes. So we're talking about potentially a delay in election results, and we know folks want those results as soon as possible, but we're also talking about potentially security. We heard the phrase and the framing about election reform, so potentially election security, are only citizens voting in this election. And then we're also looking at the transparency. How do we communicate to that voter who registered that day that, yes, we received your registration, yes, we received your provisional ballot, everything was verified and it was counted, and are they going to know that before the canvass takes place? So that's just one example. And I think as we discuss election reform, election officials really need to be at the table with that conversation, because we want to make sure that there's no unintended consequences and that we know how all of the other policies and procedures will be impacted, especially when it comes to public expectations and transparency.
Great. Thank you, Gina, and thank you for making the point about engagement of people across the spectrum when we develop reforms and making sure we avoid unintended consequences. The next question is going to go to Charley and Luis. If you could just briefly, you're both part of nationwide organizations. So tell us briefly, what is currently working or not working in other states? And as we want to learn how to proceed in a bipartisan and effective manner, where should we look for lessons learned?
Yeah, I think I'll jump in first, Charlie, if that's okay. I think we have to look at places like Denver and Virginia, where they've had a lot of success building bipartisan caucuses that have helped shepherd policy around election reform and other critical issues in the state. They've come together to help negotiate budgets and whatnot. Unite America does tremendous work in both those states, and I can say that both the Commonwealth Caucus and the other caucus in Colorado that I'm blanking on the name of, do tremendous work together. It's Republicans and Democrats coming together, breaking bread, understanding the issues of the state, and forging a path forward. I know that there's been some movement here in Arizona trying to get a somewhat similar caucus together, the Copper Caucus, built of moderate Democrats and Republicans working together in order to solve the state's issues. As we think about some of the things that have worked across other states as it relates to election reform, I mean, we look at Alaska, honestly, as a real great pinpoint and what could potentially happen in Arizona. They ran a very successful ballot initiative last election cycle that was focused on ranked choice voting and whatnot, opened up that state up to RCV, and now we're seeing kind of what's going to be happening next in the implementation and following that. But it's about, I think, educating the public on what these potential education or election reform policies look like, their impact, and then figuring out ways to come together as one community, because at the end of the day, it's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it shouldn't be that. It should be one unified constituency.
I absolutely agree. And would echo a lot of what Luis just said. I think, I do a lot of work in state legislatures, and I think, if you were just looking at the headlines, you would think that there were just, these massive blowups around voting rights everywhere. And, it was also partisan and we, can't get anything done. But actually, in two of the states that I work in, Ohio and Kentucky, we are working on some really powerful bipartisan bills and policies that have been championed by Republican secretaries of state in those states, and have been able to bring forward. And it hasn't nothing's passed yet in Kentucky, in Ohio, but in Kentucky, for example, we passed a huge package of election reforms, the biggest package for election-related policy to pass in the state in decades. And it was this kind of perfect marriage of, hey, we tried having early voting periods for the first time ever. Voters loved it. Clerks liked it because it meant there was less crowds and traffic on election day itself. Why don't we do this, while we do other important things like ensure that there's a paper trail for all of our ballots and these other kind of election integrity policies. We're able to bring those together in one package and pass something that's going to be really meaningful for helping to restore confidence in Kentucky's elections, and also provide tons of new opportunities for voters to participate in that state in new ways. And so I think it's really about finding those kinds of moderate leaders who are willing to have a conversation about how we can meet both needs. And I think that is a huge opportunity. And that's really what also gives me reason to feel optimistic about working in the voting rights space.
Awesome. Thank you very much, both Charlie and Luis. And it's important that we understand the work going on out there and how we learn from it. The next question, there are 3 or 4 questions in the chat, all regarding open primaries. So there's a question on the benefits of open primaries. There's a question about the unintended risks of open primaries. There's a question about the election security of open primaries. So I'm going to go to Ted first, and then probably Gina and Luis, just to make some comments on the pros and cons of open primaries and what you are hearing from Arizona voters about their support for that or lack of support for that.
Thank you, Blake. I think, well, first off, I want to make a distinguish. Open primaries and nonpartisan are two separate things. So, because if we get to the nonpartisan side, often voters, the only thing they know is the letter next to the name of the person they're voting for. So there's some danger of eliminating that from the ballot, in my opinion. But open primaries, does SALC and I personally think that that's a good way to go, because it levels the playing field. One, right now, if in our state, if you're an independent, you've got a whole different number of signatures you have to get on the ballot versus if you're a Democrat or a Republican. We also quite often don't get to hear the diversity of thought, even amongst the party members, either Democrat, Republican, or any of the other parties that exist by the time it gets to the general election, because it's determined in the primary. But if you go with an open primary system, everybody would be required to collect the same number of signatures. You can make it a high enough number so it's got to be somebody serious about wanting to serve. And you're going to get potentially multiple members from both parties, from some of the non-Democratic or non-Republican parties. Somebody had asked a question in the chat of what does that discourage them, the non-Democratic or non-Republican candidates from winning. That's going to be a challenge for them no matter what, just because the parties are so much smaller. But you may get them on the ballot. They may get to that point of the general ballot where everybody will see them. And I think what you're going to do is you take away that, we've heard the word moderate today thrown around a lot. I'll say just rational. I really am fine with two people that are very extreme in their positions, but if they're rational enough to have a conversation and they can work together and they can recognize that sometimes there's benefits to give and take, I think an open primary system will encourage getting more of those types of candidates onto the ballot. Now, the disclaimer is, I've been told by many political pundits, until we get higher quality candidates running, it's not going to change it no matter what system you go for. But I do believe that open primary would be beneficial.
Luis, anything that you have to add to that?
Yeah, very briefly that, United America's, one of United America's pillars is nonpartisan primaries, which is a little bit different than open primaries, as Ted pointed out. Remove the letter next to the name and whatnot in order to, in our belief, force folks to not just vote down the ballot based off party affiliation, right? I mean, I think when we look at the state of Arizona, one great example are local school boards or municipal elections, right? Where folks, it's a nonpartisan election. We all know that, there's still folks that, even though might be a nonpartisan election, are still going to, run to the right or run to the left, depending on the constituency and depending on the path to victory. I think one of the best examples that I can give in the situation in which, it forces folks to have a conversation, and obviously there were deeper politics behind this, but, just off the top of my head, 30,000 foot view here, are the Scottsdale city elections, where we ended up with a Dem mayor for the first time in a long time, right? You look at that race, you look at the conversations that had to be had, and you saw a Dem mayor or a Dem candidate who had to be a little bit more conservative, be a little bit more pragmatic, be a little bit more moderate, tailor his conversations and thoughts and messaging, talking points, et cetera, to a more conservative community. And so, that's kind of the situation that we envision across the state, a situation where you have, the best candidate running, who can be elected, who's going to properly represent folks and be pragmatic, right? Just be pragmatic. To Ted's point, be rational. The moderate term gets thrown around a lot. We've had a great history with moderates with Mr. McCain and Mr. Flake. But nowadays, I think the word rational or pragmatic is a lot better. Handing it back over to you, Blake.
Hey, Blake, Blake, could I jump in and make one comment about this? There's one other angle I think that's important to understand about open primaries, and this would be true of either open primaries or nonpartisan primaries, so I'll make that clear. Earlier in Gina's data, one of the things that caught my eye is that with the switching, the little bit of change since the election, not a lot, but one of the things that happened is, once again, and it's not the first time, the largest number of registered voters in Arizona are not partisan to the two major political parties. They're party not declared, independents, whatever you want to call them. And one of the things about open primaries is that it is very appealing to those independents. There's a reason why we see this growing number of independents. There's survey after survey about this, that a growing number of people are very frustrated by the two major political parties, the polarization that has happened, the increase in extremism in the parties over decades. That's not just this last year. And so they have become independents because they're really frustrated with the party. So one of the benefits of these reforms is to really hopefully give independents, this growing part right now, the largest number of registered voters in Arizona, a feeling like the system treats them fairly, because the system we have really disadvantages them.
And then Gina, wrap up this question by talking about, is there a concern from administering elections or election security of open primaries?
Thanks, Blake. And actually, I think I'd really like to talk about the voter perspective here when we talk about open primaries. And just a reminder, as we saw in Patrick's presentation, our current primary system was an election reform piece. It went to voters in 1998, and voters passed the current system that we have now. And I think when we look back at the data, our primaries, we have some of the lowest turnout rates. We're talking 20 to 30% in the amount of our electorate who are engaging with our primary election system today. And Clean Elections, we talk to voters about this. We engage with them in focus groups, and we engage with them in surveys, and we ask, why is that? And the top three responses are, one, I didn't know that I can participate as an independent. So I'm talking specifically about our other voters. So and Patrick was right, a big chunk of our electorate is non-affiliated. So they either didn't know that they could participate, or they didn't like the system as it was, and whereas you have to choose a partisan ballot if you're an independent voter, or they actually felt and said that they didn't think that person, that voter as an independent, should be participating in a political party's primary. And so looking at our current system, what is the purpose of the primary election? It is for the political parties to identify their nominees to advance to the general election. So that's the purpose of the current system that we have. And where do our independents fit in with that system to make up our current turnout rates for our primary? From an election administration perspective, Blake, absolutely. I mean, it's going to change the ballot style structure, how we program the elections, how we tabulate. So there absolutely would be a big impact to election administrators. But I think overall, the greatest impact is to voters and the voter education surrounding that, and them understanding, whether you are registered with a party or not, how do you participate in that election? And I want to thank Ted for making that distinguishing comment about between an open primary and a nonpartisan, because then it looks to, well, what's the voter's behavior? Do they vote their party down the ballot, maybe without even really knowing who that candidate is? And does that party designation next to that candidate name, what weight is held there? When we do have when we have nonpartisan elections, I'm always getting phone calls from folks who say, how do I know what party this candidate belongs to? So just a few things to think about there.
And Blake, if I could have one quick comment. An open primary doesn't cut the parties out, because the parties can still come in and they can, if there's 3 Republicans or 3 Democrats on the ballot on the open primary, the party can still come in and roll in favor of one of the candidates and support them. So it doesn't eliminate the party's ability to get behind a candidate that they think is best. But what it does is it exposes all the candidates to all the voters in the primary. And that I think is one of the benefits.
And if I could just add on to that, to Ted's comments, just to give you a little bit of perspective when we're talking about the candidates on the ballot. And so an independent candidate is only on the general election ballot in our current system. We had maybe about 180 candidates that were running for state and legislative office that qualified for the ballot in the 2020 general election. Less than 10 were independents. I want to say maybe even 3 off the top of my head. So you really are seeing a small, very small percentage of candidates that appear on the ballot that are not affiliated.
Yeah, I think the statistic is true. I know I found it on Google, but Arizona is the only state in the country that has never elected an independent to state legislative or statewide office. Okay, we're going to move on. There are a couple of questions in the chat about the quality of candidates. And I think Ted mentioned earlier the importance of the quality of the candidates. So I'm going to go to Charley first. How does election system reform improve the quality of the candidates? And are there particular reforms that you've seen or have evidence of being effective at improving, in quotes, the quality of the candidate?
Yeah, I think in my experience, this is a little bit outside the scope of what Secure Democracy does, but I think in my experience, it's open primaries and it's ranked choice voting help get stronger candidates out in the mix. I think it's also about, what infrastructure is there, what groups are encouraging people to run for office. It's a really big commitment to undertake, particularly if you're not, a political insider. It can be very daunting to run for office. And so I think it's also about, what kind of support and infrastructure exists that is finding good people and saying, you should run and it should be you and you should go for it. And so I think those are, I think there are, some kind of system changes that help, higher quality candidates succeed. But I think a lot about, getting folks to run is about asking good people to run and supporting them in doing that.
Ted, do you have another comment you'd like to make on this topic?
Oh, Charlie hit the end of the comment was the best. It's finding good quality candidates, supporting them and trying to get them to run. But the system's going to make a difference. Nobody who's potentially very successful in their private life already, whether it's in a nonprofit environment, in a for-profit environment, doesn't matter. They're not going to want to give all that up to enter into a system that they think they either can't run on their own morals or their own grounds, and they have to conform to something else in order to be successful. So right now, I believe our system doesn't encourage having those high quality candidates. Ultimately, we've still got to get those people to be willing to stand up in the public eye, which is not an easy thing to do, and run.
Blake, if I could just chime in on this as well, I think the other factor, it's in one of the other questions, so maybe we'll get more to it, but we have talked a lot about the influence of money in politics, but we know that's another factor overall in the dynamics of our political system. It certainly is contributing to much of the voters' perspective about how fair the overall system is, because there's a sense that people who have a lot of money or particular interests that have a lot of money have too much influence on the system. So I actually think that's another important factor. Even if you do the systemic reform, you also kind of need to look at how the financing, even if you have an open primary system and ranked choice voting, how does the financing of the campaigns affect those results? Because there will be interests that will look to find advantage with any system. And so I think it's also important that the reforms related to campaign finance should be considered alongside the systemic reforms.
And if I could just jump in there real quick, Blake, I thought it was really interesting as we're talking about this discussion of finding candidates to run, when we talk about, well, what is it, once you get elected, what does that mean? And the time that you have to commit as an elected official. And I always go back to the voters. And Arizona does have a commission for the salaries of elected officials. And the last time that went to the ballot was, I believe, in 2014, where, what is the compensation that these elected officials are receiving for being in office? And, what does that play? What kind of factor does that contribute to whether or not somebody can run for office because of the time commitment, the personal time commitment that they are investing into being an elected official? But just going back to the 2014 canvas I pulled up, the voters said no, they didn't want to raise those salaries for elected officials, and it was overwhelmingly no. And so, as we talk about those things and look at all of these interesting voter perspectives, I again wanted to point out that Arizona does have that commission. And so what does that mean, and how does that impact the search for those candidates?
Yeah, and I think so. I saw some recent polling data that we were involved with that showed 33% of people believe that the Arizona legislature is currently doing a good job, and only 14% think that current elected leaders are very good to excellent. So there certainly are some questions out there. Which leads us to another question that's come up a couple of times in the chat. And I'm going to ask Luis and Charlie, I think, to answer this one. because you all have done polling and so on, and that is, what kind of election reforms do Arizonans currently support based on the polling and the work that you've done? So regardless of what you or your organization believes or you personally believe, what are the ones that are currently supported that, if it were out there, could pass?
Thank you, Blake. I think that's a really good question. I'll start off by saying that Arizonans love vote by mail. I mean, it's been it continuously heard when 3 million plus people use it in order to express their vote. I mean, it just speaks volumes about the importance of protecting it and ensuring that it's something that the legislature can't touch or water down or whatever you want to do with it, right? As far as reforms or other things that Arizonans support, I think it's very high on the accountability transparency side. A lot of cleanup. Arizona already has one of the best election systems in the entire country that we like. United America likes to push up and use as a model. I think we're only in our individual category, we're only number 2 to a state like Colorado in the way that we function or the things that we do and whatnot in order to show transparency, accountability, and access to the ballot. So is there a lot for us to do just in the sense that we can clean up and move things around and whatnot? I don't think so. I think that the bigger conversation has to happen around the way that we elect officials, right? And that's where we kind of come together and say, well, what's the perfect form? What's the perfect, what's the secret sauce, right? To get the biggest ROI here. Those are our thoughts. That's what we think. Again, we're already pretty good in everything that we do. So it's just a matter of figuring out how we get pragmatic folks into the legislature and into some of these offices.
I agree. I think that's all exactly right. I think from our polling of Arizonans, we've seen Arizonans, like Louis said, love vote by mail, want to see that protected, want to see that expanded. And Arizonans oppose policies that they see as restricting their individual freedom to vote and vote how they choose. And so I think those are some of the big things, at kind of the 10,000 foot level. But, we also see that Arizonans want additional election security measures put in place. But again, don't realize that Arizona actually already has most of those policies in state law. And so a lot of what Arizonans want to see, we actually already do in the state. And so it's more about how do we communicate that to people? How do we make sure that people know all of the different steps that our clerks and recorders take when a ballot arrives in the mail, and what does all of that look like? And I think that's a kind of big opportunities we're thinking about election reform is there does need to be more education about what is already done to help people kind of wrap their heads around what reform could look like. And so I think there's a big opportunity as well for advocates to really define what election reform looks like. And, is it open primaries? Is it ranked choice voting? Or, what are kinds of all of the pieces that advocates think, we should be moving towards in Arizona? And then how do we bring Arizonans along with us on that kind of journey?
So Ted, that's a little bit about what the voters think. Tell us a little bit about what the business leaders think about election reform and why that might be important.
Well, Blake, it's absolutely something we are exploring now. I mean, obviously, it's how I met you, how we've gotten into this, and it's been a focus of SALC for quite a while. We think there is something out there. The irony with we've talked about open primaries a lot today. Well, I pointed out earlier, 28 of the 29 cities. The one that doesn't use it is the city of Tucson. So we're dealing with that already down here. But use an open primary system. So when we start talking about open primaries, and people don't understand or have a hard time understanding, we don't have to point any farther than look at how you elect your municipal mayors and council members already. That is the concept behind open primaries. The difference would be is if it's nonpartisan or if you're going to continue to have partisan politics involved in there. From the business perspective, I mean, Patrick made a great point, the fundraising, the financials, what's at play in there. Well, the fact of the matter is it's going to be hard to get the money out of it, because the people that are being elected are making decisions that are going to impact not only our way of life, our quality of life, but our economy and a lot of things. So money will always be there. But what the business community truly wants is they want to know that we've got fair, open, secure elections that people can trust in the outcomes, but more importantly, that we get good quality legislators that are representing us either for our region, for our state, if it's on the federal level, and that everybody knows they've got some level of access. Too often in the current system, the access only goes to those who can really support and ensure the reelection, and that makes it tough. I mean, I've dealing with the state legislature, I've had many legislators who said, if you need my vote for your initiative or your bill or what you're trying to work on to pass, I'll do it, but I prefer not to. And the reason they prefer not to isn't because they think what we're asking them to do is bad. They understand it, especially from a transactional economic standpoint, but they know that their vote for something that we may be pushing as the business community may create problems for them in their reelection. And too often we've got people thinking about their reelection and the impact of the vote and not what's the right thing to do with their vote. And that I think we need to, as the business organization, which is nonpartisan, but that doesn't mean we're not political. And it certainly doesn't mean our members aren't partisan, because they are. But we want a system that works and allows to have that open engagement. And we'd love to see legislators working together and not just fall on a straight party line that we see quite often. Because what we need for our education system, for our infrastructure, for our economy is not always on a straight party line.
Great. Thank you very much, Ted. We've got time for one more question, and there's a couple of questions in the chat and one in the Q&A about election security and trust in our elections. And we know, in looking at polling data, there is a significant portion of our electorate that's very concerned about election fraud. So when we talk about election system reform, what are those election system reforms that we think can, improve the trust in our elections and in the outcome of our elections?
I'll go with that one.
Go ahead, Gina.
Happy to tackle that one. And I'm going to reiterate what I heard Luis and Charlie say, and that I wholeheartedly agree with. And first, Arizona has a fantastic election system. I will champion that to my grave. We have a system that has a lot of options for voters. And I think when we look at how diverse our state, options are huge. And when we're talking about the system to participate, I think those options, encourage people to participate, and it lends to their convenience. And again, I really do think we have a fantastic system when it comes to how can somebody get their ballot, but also the security measures that we have in place. We have a decentralized election system. We have layers upon layers of election security. The processes and procedures that we have been developed by and with election administrator experience and influence over years. And we have a procedures manual that outlines all of this. And every concern that I have ever heard in my entire career as an election official from voters, it's all been accounted for. And it's a matter of educating that person on what that process is. And Charlie touched on that. I think when we talk about election reform and what can instill the greatest confidence in voters about the security of our elections is voter education, just letting them know what the process is, because once we can communicate to them, they will have that confidence in the system, because those measures exist. We have those security measures in place. It's not a 100% reliance on one piece of the pie. We don't completely rely on the machines. We have checks and balances for them. We don't completely rely that somebody is a citizen. There's a verification for it. We don't completely rely that the person is who they say they are. There's, voter ID requirements. Whatever the concern is that I've heard from voters, again, in my experience, we have security measures in place for it. And so I really think when we talk about election reform, it all comes down to that voter education component. How can we let voters know about the system as it exists today? Because if you know that, then you have your baseline for that reform.
Great. Thank you very much, Gina. Ted, you have a quick comment, and then we're going to go to
just a quick one. We've politicized this whole issue so bad this year. It's obviously a fallout of the last election cycle, the partisan arguments, everything else. I think when the next year turns around, maybe 2 years from now, maybe at some point in the future, a lot of the bills that were run have been absolutely horrendous. But a lot of them you kind of go, okay, that might make sense. But when it's in a non-hostile partisan environment, I think that's the time when you look at some of the things that may give some people security on what we're doing. I mean, all everybody wants to do is make it accessible, get as many legal voters to vote, and make sure that everybody has that vote and it gets counted. That's all we care about. And that's the thing I think we should all strive for ultimately in our the way we run our republic in a democratic manner. We want to have that. So we can't be afraid of going back and saying we can tweak little things, but Gina hit it right on the head. And Governor Ducey reiterated it. We do not have significant election problems in the state of Arizona. We have a system that can be trusted, and a lot of it is just education.
Great. Thank you very much. So, based on the large number of questions and the large number of participants today, there's certainly a lot of interest in this topic. So we appreciate all of your engagement. We're going to wrap up by asking each one of the panelists to give you a one-sentence takeaway from today's discussion. And we will start with Ted.
We're better than we think we are, but we can always improve.
All right, Charley.
And there are huge opportunities to pursue a middle road and compromise around election reform, something that will benefit all voters and all elected officials as well.
Patrick.
We deserve a system where every voter feels like they are an active participant in our democracy and that the state is a better place as a result.
Luis.
It's critical that we put country over party.
And Gina, you get the last word.
Talk to your election officials when considering election reform. And one thing I'll leave you with, consider civics back in the classroom as we talk about both qualified candidates to run and voters who want to vote and participate.
Fantastic. So to close, we would certainly like to thank all of our panelists for their participation today. You all have been a pleasure to work with and a wealth of information throughout this process. We'd also like to thank the Flynn Foundation and the Southern Arizona Leadership Council for co-sponsoring today's discussion. Please review the resources available at the Flinn-Brown Center for Civic Leadership on this and other topics, and check out the upcoming CivEx sessions. All of the attendees today will receive an email with a link to the recording of this session, and you'll also be able to look at the Flinn-Brown resources available. So we appreciate your engagement, your participation, and we will look forward to working with each and every one of you as we look for the future of election system reform in Arizona. Thank you.